Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Have worked with Ben, and his reputation certainly precedes him. Ben and I have been working together for about the last 5 years. I'm John Sangiovanni, by the way. I manage Microsoft Research, University Relations, and academic funding as it relates to mobile computing, wireless technologies, user interfaces. And actually, Ben and his lab are the recipient of a very exciting 3-year, $1 million collaborative research partnership. And Microsoft Research has actually created a center for information, for interaction design and information visualization there. And there's some really, really cool research that's coming out of it. Ben has been a real essential asset in the sense that he's been able to evolve the .NET platform in its earliest phases to make it more applicable to custom controls, and more recently has been driving an effort to lead a new toolkit to build custom controls in .NET called Piccolo.NET, which we'll talk about a little bit through the course of this talk. Ben's research interests are very wide and extremely interesting. He has focused on everything from information design to interaction design and many interesting things in between, published in many publications, and actually has many collaborators here at Microsoft Research, both with the Vibe team and also within product groups. So he's a real top-tier partner with Microsoft and has some really interesting things to show us today. This talk is going to be about how to keep interfaces in the flow, which is, I think, is something that we certainly have a lot to learn at Microsoft. But he's going to talk a lot about how to create interfaces that really enable the user and provide an interesting on-ramp. So without any more delay, we'll go ahead and dive into Ben's talk, and of course we'll have a session for a question and answer afterwards. Thanks for coming.
Thanks very much, John. As John said, I've been doing a lot of things, and this talk is going to be an attempt to try and bring all of them together. So it's a bit of a challenge. Sometimes you want to really dive down deep into some things, and we'll try instead and take a slightly broader view. Will be time afterwards to go into more detail if people have questions. But part of the reason for this is after having gotten tenure last year, I feel like, it's my job to try and take a step back and think a little bit more broadly about what it is that we're trying to do. And as interface designers, and as a personal computer user, I have observed that there are lots of parts in my life where I feel really engaged in what I'm doing. I'm totally there, right? Time passes. I'm not even aware of how much time I've spent. I haven't gotten up to go to the bathroom in 6 hours. And then there's other times when that doesn't happen. Okay, it might be when you're, trying to write and you've got writer's block and you keep on looking at your email or doing anything you possibly can to delay. But one of the things that I am aware of, and this is only anecdotal evidence, but there are very, how do I say this politely? Using computers is not one of the times when people are more likely to be in the flow, right? We have tons and tons of anecdotal stories about people having computer rage, and whether it's throwing their computer monitors out the window, or I actually opened up Technology Review magazine this morning and saw a big I think it was USA Today in the hotel. And there was a big full-page advertisement about someone experiencing computer rage because I couldn't get the printer to work properly. So this very clearly is a major part of unfortunately, our societal experience of using computers. Rage is the far extreme. That's when we're very clearly not in the flow. But what I want to focus on today is all of the smaller times when interfaces get in the way of us being engaged in whatever it is that we're trying to do. It is hard to try and identify exactly what flow means. We all have a good sort of intuitive sense of this experience as humans in the world. There fortunately has been some effort to study this a little bit more rigorously. A guy named Csikszentmihalyi, who was at the University of Chicago for many years, studied what he called optimal experience. And he did this strange kind of thing. He gave people pagers and interrupted them 8 or 10 times a day to see what they were doing and what their state of mind was, basically. And he did this to tens of thousands of people with many collaborators around the world and captured hundreds of thousands of individual human experiences, and then did what you can think of as a gigantic cluster analysis. Tried to and identify what are the characteristics of human experience, of human activity that was associated with optimal experience. And what he found was that these flowful or really highly engaged positive experiences were associated with a number of activities, the state of mind that you're in, and some individuals were more or less likely to have it. But he was able to categorize some of the key elements. So what I'm going to try and do today is briefly use his research as a kind of a guidepost to what I can think of as recommendations for interface design that we can use to try and give us a better chance of being more engaged in our work. So the first thing that Csikszentmihalyi found was that people that were most engaged in whatever activity they were doing were typically engaged in activities that were challenging and required skill. They had to put some energy into learning what they were doing and applying those skills that they learned. So whether it was tennis or programming or even rock climbing, people that were really putting some cognitive effort into what they were doing were likely to be able to get fully engaged. So this is, the reason I point this out is this is very different from the feeling that you might have when you're sitting on a beach, which might be enjoyable, but is not something that is highly cognitively demanding and is not likely to engage in this, help you have this kind of really active, deep experience. So that begs the question, do we really want interfaces that are really hard to learn and challenging and make you focus on them? And the answer is, of course not. That's not what I don't want you to spend time focusing on the interface. But, well, first of all, we do want to focus on the task. The task may be challenging. We hope the interface doesn't get in the way. But one of the surprising things is that even if the interface does require some effort, if it requires some learning, it might be acceptable if it enables you to do these other things better, such as be really engaged in the activity and focus on avoiding some of the repetitive and boring things that you might otherwise have to do. So some of my favorite traditional tools that enabled me, that have these characteristics, are Photoshop and Emacs, both of which people that have gotten over this hurdle of learning to use them, which is dramatically hard, right? I'm not going to say that this is that they're easy to become really proficient with, but for those people that do, they absolutely love them. So why is it? What is it about these tools that makes it worth suffering through in order to be able to use effectively? And the answer is, I think, that it enables you to be more powerful. It gives you a bigger hammer, right? It amplifies your abilities as a computer user. And it does that by letting you do complex tasks easily and by supporting automation of repetitive tasks. So Csikszentmihalyi tried to summarize all of these things with this little graph where I think he used the example of tennis, where it doesn't matter so much whether you are an expert user or an expert tennis player or a novice tennis player. What matters is that you are engaged at the right level. Right? Two novice tennis players that are equally matched can have a really engaging, fun game. And two expert tennis players that are equally matched can have a really fun, engaging, deep game. But when a novice player plays an expert, it's usually not good for either one of them. And so that sort of motivates us to think about that it's important for the interface to match users' expectations. You don't want to support really complex macros if somebody is just learning how to use the interface and doesn't even understand what a macro is, or at least you want to hide that feature, right? So you need to have this match between users' ability and what they're trying to accomplish. So I'm going to punctuate this talk with some examples of work that I've done or other people have done to try and point out some of the issues that I think come up. So many of you have seen me talk about this photo work that I've been doing for a while. I've built a system called PhotoMesa, and I built it mostly for her. because I take an infinite number of pictures of my daughter, and I want some good tools to support it. So I keep on doing this on the side. I just want to show this to you very briefly. Because what it does is, for me, is it enables me to concentrate on the task domain, thinking about the photos, and less so on the interface domain. So there's a few ways that it does that. First of all, it lets me get a visual overview of all the photos that I'm looking at. So I happen to have loaded here, it looks like 5 folders of images, and they're laid out to all fit on the screen in a space-filling way, which could be a problem because they're small, but it uses what I call a zoomable user interface to navigate. So first of all, when you mouse over, you get a preview of the images right in place. And this is crucial, right, because your attention tracks where your cursor is. Some interfaces have, or at least the good news is I think today's photo browsers have gotten away from it. But earlier, you would double-click and open up a window and then have to manage the window and click a little X to close it. And that kind of thing was highly disruptive. But even AC/DC and many others still have a preview window off to the side. So you click on the thumbnail, and then you see the preview over here. But really what that means is you focus over the mouse, you click, and then your eye has to shift over to the preview window. Then your eye has to, I have to log in now. This is going to keep on popping up. That was disruptive. And didn't even like it. Now, this is particularly disruptive because I think well, let's not go into that. It may keep on coming back. The traditional photo browsing things, you can only get by something like you can only look at a preview something like once a second, right? Click, shift your attention, look, shift your attention back, click again. And the idea of having the previews follow the thumb, even though it's not a nice traditional window, the preview is right where your focus already is. The next thing that we do is the red rectangle that follows you around tells you where you're going to go when you click. So those images within that region, right, are what I'm going to focus on when I click. And so eventually I can get to the one-to-one. So, and the interface basically is just left-click to zoom in and right-click to zoom out. And it's simple. This is looking at now 214 images on something like 800 pixels worth. So I would argue that this is more than you can easily grok with the scrolling list of thumbnails. The other thing we've been focusing on to try and support automation of automated tasks is annotation, which I'm not going to go into here, but we put a lot of energy, as Steve has and other folks have, on really good ways for bulk annotation so that you can try and decrease the manual annotation effort to less than one-to-one. Right? So you can somehow group things together and then with a single drag annotate a whole bunch of photos. But we'll get back to photos a little bit more later. So the second thing that Csikszentmihalyi found was that it's crucial for people to be able to concentrate on whatever the task is. If they're feeling interrupted, then it's going to likely get in the way of their flow, right? As we just experienced, interfaces that, if the interface is in control and it tells you what it wants to do rather than you choosing what you want to do and when, then you're asking for trouble. So there's lots of examples of these kinds of places where these issues come up, and I think they're really interesting. So since Sue is here, somewhere, the Sue, I thought I would pick on her a little bit, even though I know she's going to say it's not my fault. So with the stuff I've seen, which is transmogrified into MSN desktop search, which I love and actually I use, and I think it's great in many, many ways, it has a feature that drives me batty, which is that when I do a search, I get a list of emails, and I'm not sure exactly which one I want, so I want to click on an email. I have to open up a window and then close the window, so that's sort of going back to like the old photo browser style interfaces, which is a problem in its own. But the search window gets lowered behind Outlook. And so after you close your email, you're now facing Outlook rather than the search window you just were in. And I'm sure I can imagine what the technical reason is for that happening. But it means that if I want to have a user task which is scanned through a bunch of possible search hits, I have to go through all kinds of window manipulation every single time. And it's almost a big enough reason for me to not want to use that tool. Something I'm sure you guys are familiar with. But So in general, when we have interfaces that where the interface takes you away from the task domain and makes you focus on the interface, such as that, it's problematic. And there's lots and lots of examples of it. Another is PowerPoint, where you might want to go into slide sorter mode to navigate. So I'm actually not using PowerPoint here. I've used a little tool that I've made to enable me to navigate within the context of presenting. So if somebody wants to ask me a question about what we just were, I can click here to navigate or come back here. And hopefully do that with a little bit less disruption than the traditional massive mode change. All of these places where I'm trying to convince you that we have enabled better flow, not all of them, but many of them use animation in the interface to help you feel less distracted. The reason for that is because if animation is designed properly, then it has a potential for helping a user to see the relationship between the multiple views. If you don't do that, and you have some kind of jump, so one interface is here, and then all of a sudden there's a jump and it changes quickly to something else, you have to use a little bit of brain power to think about what just happened and about where you are. So one way to think about it is that animation has the potential for reducing short-term memory load, right? Because your visual processing part of your brain can see that connection between these two interfaces, and you don't really have to think about it so consciously. So this is hard to prove, but we did do one small targeted study that I think is really interesting. We looked at animation during scrolling. So we scroll documents all the time. And sometimes when you scroll, say by clicking the down arrow, the document jumps up a few lines, say an inch. And sometimes it smoothly moves up an inch. Well, which is better? Animation slows you down, right? It takes a few hundred milliseconds to actually animate the movement of the document. So should you animate or should you not? Well, it seems like people don't really know, because there's a complete hodgepodge. If you look across products, including within this company, you'll find that sometimes things are animated and sometimes they're not. So we did a study where we had users look at 3 different document types at 4 different animation speeds, where they would basically read a document, click on the down arrow, and either the document would jump up 3 lines or it would smoothly move up 3 lines. And we used 4 time conditions, basically instantaneous or 100, 300, and 500 milliseconds. And we had them read the text aloud and counted how fast they were at reading the text and how many mistakes they made, and then looked at subjective preference. And there's this really nice result that shows that if it jumps instantly, meaning the fastest interface, task performance is the slowest. And if you have a 300 millisecond animation, then you had a modest performance speed improvement. But they had 50% or half the errors, where errors were like reading the wrong line or duplicating a word or something like that, or stuttering because they weren't sure exactly where they were, and a significant subjective preference. So this is a really nice example, one of the very hard to come by, where we have a really clear result. So animation can be risky. You can do it badly. You can slow things down. You can get in the way. But if it's done right, it can really help. One other last thing about this study that was kind of interesting. I mentioned we looked at 3 different document types. One of our hypotheses was that the more visually distinguished the documents were, the less value animation would provide, because you would be able to see where the documents moved by these visual landmarks. And it didn't show that here, but we also found that out. We had very visual documents with lots of pictures and stuff, pure text, and then abstract documents that were just like symbols, so that there was absolutely no visual distinction at all. And in fact, we found that this result was highly correlated with that. So the less visually distinguished the document, the more animation helped. Question?
Do you actually advocate bringing animation to places where people aren't used to having animation, like things like on a web page or something like that? Or given that people are already used to click, total refresh of the screen?
It really depends on what the animation is providing. So I definitely am not in favor of animation in all cases just for animation's sake. So if you're clicking on a link and you're getting a new page, it's not clear to me that animation will help because there isn't really a semantic relationship between and the interface between the old page and the new page. Animation, I found, is most likely to help when there is something about the interface itself where you can actually learn something by the connection. And so it works well. Well, the example I gave is very clear. Zooming, if you have spatial information, so that user can build up a little bit of knowledge of where they are in the document or in the document space, then I think that's the case where it's most likely to help. If you had a web task where you were doing a lot of revisiting, you were going through a site and going to this page and this page and this page and this page, then there is some potential for having some kind of visual layout of those web pages in some kind of space and having some really fast animation between those web pages. We had actually experimented with that kind of thing some time back, and it has some potential. For general web browsing, I would be a little bit skeptical. So another thing that I've observed about interaction is I've talked a little bit about expert users, right? The Photoshop and Emacs users. But we also have to think about novice users, right? People start off as novices, right? The first time they've seen a computer by their nature, they're novice. They have to learn what is possible in the interface from the interface. And that's why graphical user interfaces have taken off, right? Because you can learn from the interface. You can explore the interface. You can try pull-down menus. You can click on things. There are visual affordances for trying things out. And that enables you to learn something about the interface just by using it. And that's great. But what happens? Well, so the simple example is, suppose you want to execute a copy command on a menu, right? So we can explore the pull-down menus, see under Edit, there's something called Copy, and we can click on it, and that works. But what happens after we've done it 50 times? Well, first of all, in order to operate that interface, we get visual feedback from the interface, right? And that's actually what enables it to work. When I mouse over something, it highlights. And when I click on Edit, this menu comes down. I get visual feedback to help teach me about what is going on as I'm doing it. But it's the very nature of that feedback that is disruptive, that breaks your concentration. The thing about that Edit Copy menu is that it's impossible for me to use that menu without feedback from the interface. Right? People cannot use mice in most interfaces blind, right? For lots of reasons. For one thing, mice are implemented with all kinds of acceleration, so there's no absolute relationship between physical position and cursor position. So you have to get feedback. And even if you turned off acceleration, it's very hard for people to judge absolute values of linear arm and hand movement. So the traditional alternative is to do something like keyboard shortcuts, right? Which is the standard adult interface, which is very nice because you do get some tactical feedback from the keyboard, but very little. You can almost just think, and if you're an expert typist and you have your hands on the keyboard, think, execute Control-C. Think Control-C, and your fingers pretty much just execute it. You hardly have to think about it, right? It's nearly an autonomous interaction. You think, the activity happens. It's kind of like using a hammer or a pencil. Really good tools have implicit feedback so that you don't have to put a lot of conscious energy into it. The problem, though, is that while keyboard shortcuts are great, it's a totally different interface than the graphical user interface. Even though we can learn the expert interface from the novice interface, it's not the same interface. It's a different one. And so to me, it seems like sort of an obvious design goal that we should try to think about how to support users going from novice to expert with the same interface, not through a completely different interface where you happen to learn the expert interface from the novice interface. And there's a few of these that people have done, but almost exclusively in the research world, and not too many. So my favorite current example is the work by Shuman Zai at IBM, who's recently, for the last many years have been working on text input, pen text input. How many people are familiar with this? All right, so fair number, so I won't go into great detail. But the quick idea is that, first of all, he's made a hexagonal keyboard layout. It's a virtual keyboard. He's reorganized the layout of the letters based on statistical properties of letter pair frequency. So in English, if TH happens to appear next to each other frequently in words, then those two letters will be adjacent to each other on the keyboard. And the key thing about this is that it's a single interface that goes through these three levels of interaction. So a novice can use this just by searching and tapping. I want to type in the word, I think you can barely see this example, but it says Johnny. So I could type in could tap J, search for O, tap, search for H, tap, search for N, tap, and so on, right? And that the super novice could learn to do this. But what happens after these 50 times that they've typed in the word Johnny? They start to know where these things are. And when you go to tap from J to O, you might accidentally not lift your mouse up all the way, or your pen. Or then you start to learn that you can really just tap here and drag. And you can just drag through these sequences, which is sort of a natural sequence after learning to tap. And the software recognizes initially just dragging inflection points. So when there's a sharp angle, it recognizes that you executed O because you came here and then went back, and you executed H because you went here and then you went this way, and so on. And so it supports this expert use that just happens naturally based on physical repetition. Then he went one step further, which is interesting but not relevant to this, which is that you don't even have to get on these things exactly, because he can use statistics about what words are likely. So you can see over here he actually missed the N. But it still gets it because there aren't any English words that go J-O-H-G, for example. The third thing that Csikszentmihalyi observed is that activities where users had clear goals and feedback from the system to where they are in the task were more likely to help people be fully engaged in what they were doing. This is something actually that overall I think the computer interface world has been doing relatively well. So of all the things I'm complaining about, I think this is the one I'll complain about the least. There's certainly good visual feedback in graphical user interfaces. There are certainly now plenty of places that give you really good feedback as to where you are in the task. I think a lot of e-commerce websites have really nice kind of multi-step phases saying you are now in step 3. You still need to type in your billing address and then click submit. Right? Those kinds of things I think are really good, and they work. So that's a nice example. One of the places where there is still, I think, a challenge, and this is something that Ben Shneiderman has been pushing for quite a while, is in database access, where actually this is even getting better too. But in database access, it's often the case where you're still typing in something into a form and getting back 0 hits or tons of hits, because you don't know what kind of data is underneath the form. And if you don't know something about the database, which by and large users never do, it's sort of the nature of being a user, is you don't know what the data is underneath, that if you're not informed about that data as part of the interface, you're asking for trouble. So how can you design an interface to help users get a sense of what's there? So here's 2 examples. This was an early example from our lab to support users to look for satellite data from NASA's Earth Science database system. And the problem was the same thing. People would make very, very specific queries and get back nothing, because they wanted something from this part of the world, from this time period, with this scanning technology, and whoops, there's no data. Well, now what do I do? How do I find that data? So this was an example where there is a blue dot over the regions of the world where there is data, and then there are a few dynamic controls where you could change those controls and see where there is data. So this happened to be a range slider on year, and with this range you could see that there's nothing in Western Australia, so I don't have to bother clicking. I don't have to bother doing a query for that. Right? So this is a kind of query preview that gives you some metadata about the database before you actually go and execute the details of your query. So a more current example that we've been working on is something called the International Children's Digital Library, which is a fun project I've been working on actually with my wife, Allison Druin, at the University of Maryland. And Microsoft has actually been helping us out a little bit with this, even though it's sort of farther away from some of our other projects. But one of the ways that Microsoft has been involved is giving us tablet PCs that we've been using to give to children to see what their experience is reading online and searching online in a better experience. So it's kind of interesting. So this is a site. You can actually go here now. This is the live site, icdlbooks.org. We've been scanning and deploying children's books from around the world. And there's a whole bunch of interesting parts of this project. But I just want to show you very briefly the part of the project that's relevant to what I'm talking about right now, which is helping children get a sense of what is in the database. So this is the simple search. It doesn't look like most other search interfaces you've seen. It's highly specialized for children's books. And so in lots of ways. First of all, while we do support keyword search, the interface focuses on supporting browsing through a faceted search. So we have these facets or categories. And the categories are highly tuned to what we found to be the way that children want to look for books. And it's kind of unusual, but it's true, that especially younger children are really interested in looking for books based on their physical characteristics. So I can do something like look for books that have orange in their cover. Okay? Or maybe I just want orange award-winning books, or just orange award-winning picture books. And so there's all kinds of things that have just happened here. First of all, right, I've performed a kind of a simple Boolean query. I've disallowed implicitly queries that would have resulted in 0 hits, right? Because there are no books, there are no books like that are also long. So it doesn't even let you do that. I have a visual representation of the query as that's been formed. I actually can integrate keyword search as well, so I can look for books about cats with all those characteristics, and there's one of them. Right? I can modify this and eventually get to a particular book and read it. So this is fun. You should go check it out in any case. But the key issue in all of these things is how to help people feel like they are in control of what it is that they're doing. And that includes understanding what's going on with the data. So Csikszentmihalyi, while he teased out these separate characteristics, you'll see that there's a lot of overlap in some of these. And so maintaining control has a lot to do with giving feedback as well. But what Csikszentmihalyi was focusing on with this fourth point is that every time a user feels like they have lost control of the interface, right, that the interface is taking control from the user's hands, then it is disruptive to their train of thought. And I know John and I have this conversation all the time. He was just telling me this morning while I was complaining about text entry on my phone. He said, "Oh, T9 is awesome. Just go use it. It'll just work." And I said, "Well, yeah, I know, but it doesn't work perfectly." Which means that every time I enter a word, I have to check to see whether the word I entered is right. Which means after every single word, I am to have to disrupt my train of thought. To me, it's the worst possible text entry system because it's continuously disruptive. It may well be faster than multitap. In fact, I'm sure it's faster than multitap. But it's more disruptive to my train of thought. So there's lots and lots of examples with this. And there are, I mean, I guess, in general, I think of this as the problem with adaptive interfaces. There are lots of adaptive interfaces that have great potential, and T9 is one of them. The problem is to me, it's a matter of accuracy, right? If it's only 10% accurate, it's guaranteed to be terrible. We all agree about that. If it's 99.9% accurate, if it guesses what you want, what you mean almost all the time, then that's great too. But where is the threshold? And my view is that most designers tend to put that threshold too low. They tend to think that T9 is good enough, and I don't think it is. Because if you feel like, if the user feels like they're having to always check on the computer's guess, if they're always having to second guess what they intended to do by looking at the interface for feedback, then they're out of control. So there's lots and lots of examples of this. My favorite example to pick on, only because I know that a lot of people agree with me, is adaptive menus in Office. I know lots of people like them too, but they're problematic because sometimes the thing that you want isn't there, which means that essentially the same issue. I think it's more accurate than T9. The bar is a little bit higher, so that's good. But sometimes what you want to do isn't available, and so it disrupts you. And there are alternatives. That's the main point, is that you don't have to have adaptive interfaces to make to decrease the complexity of user interfaces. So we made a mock-up of an interface for Windows Explorer folder navigation to try and address the same issue that Office did with its adaptive menus. The problem is that there are too many options that the user has to deal with, and you want to hide the ones that are not commonly used. It's a very reasonable approach. The question is, how do those things get hidden? And the adaptive approach is the computer looks to see how you're using things and automatically hides. And the manual approach is start off with a reasonable default, hide the things that through design experience you found most users don't want, and hide them perhaps in a similar way through some kind of special interfacing. There's more stuff hidden here. And then just let users decide when they want to expose something or hide something. Right? It's configurable interface rather than an adaptive interface. Or if you really want to adapt things, then have some little indicator, like I've noticed that you aren't using these things. Do you want to make this single point in time when the interface is going to change, and put that under the user's control?
So what about discoverability? So if you're putting up the subset that most users, let's say 85% of users would use, there are some people who will really be looking for that.
Right, of course.
So,
well, so I mean, this solution is the same as Office adaptive menus, which is some kind of little visual glyph that says there's more stuff. So here are the things we think you want. Here's more. In this case, we used ellipses. So here's my Windows Explorer, and I hid 90% of my things. Yeah. These are sort of ... So you see projects, here's 2 of them, and the rest is under ... So C: only has 6 top-level directories. It doesn't have Windows. Yeah, it's like more. So yeah, you have to do something. It takes up space. It slows down the user guaranteed when they're getting to one of those advanced things. So it's a trade-off. But if you leave it under user control, this is almost the same as the Office menus, but it's manual instead of adaptive.
What if the user starts typing the title of the menu?
Oh, sure. You can have all kinds of other things. Like we also had search within the menu structure, so you could search and find hidden things as well. But that's right. There's that's orthogonal issues. So yes, you should always be able to search your complex information spaces as well as browsing. But that's a separate issue. Okay. So last thing. I think I'm actually on time for this talk. That's amazing. The last thing that Csikszentmihalyi found is that when people are really engaged in what they're doing, their perception of time changes. Sometimes they senses that time speeds up or that it slows down, but mostly if they're really engaged in what they're doing, then time seems to pass more quickly. So there's some interesting issues here. So Mary actually did some great work a few years ago looking at relative subjective duration. And this is the idea that if you can use this principle that people's perception of time changes as a way to potentially measure how deeply engaged they were. So it's sort of an alternative to doing a traditional survey after the fact of asking subjective preference. You can say, well, have people do a task, measure how long it actually took, and then ask them how long they thought it took. And if they thought it took less time than it actually took, then that's good. That's an indication that they were engaged and not feeling disrupted. Conversely, if they felt that it took longer than it actually took, then that's bad. So she has tried to apply this a few times, and I have, and we have not had great results. Isn't that right? Have you? You have.
Yeah.
Oh, last time I asked you, you said you hadn't.
No, we
Okay, well, all right. So sometimes I have not had great results in measuring this. And the reason is that the data is very noisy. And the time estimates are just too short to really get good significant data. So it's a real phenomena, but I found that at least it's hard to measure this. So I'll have to chat with you more and see what you've been doing to make it work. Longer times, right. So, however, there are other examples where we have measured objective and performance versus some kinds of subjective performance difference and found huge, huge differences. So one of the projects I'm working on recently is to look at usability of voting machines. And this is a highly political subject, so political that I cannot tell you today what the names of these two machines are. We have to go through a process to get our results approved by all the vendors before we. They can't veto what we say, but we promise to let them give us feedback before we criticize them. So anyway, we did a control. We did look at lots of different ways, but one of the things we did is we had 40 people use 6 machines in a controlled setting in a lab and videotaped them in the whole business, and looked at all kinds of things. But one of the things we looked at was how long they actually spent doing things, and then we asked them a question. Oh, I believe the question. It was something like, how fast did you feel you were on this machine? Something like that. So blue is objective performance. Pretty much identical. And how productive do you feel on this machine? In minutes. And there was nearly a factor of, complete factor of 2 difference. And by looking at these things, it was absolutely clear to us. One of the machines was reasonably good and one of them was horrible. But the horrible one, people learned how to use. But it was highly disruptive. It was highly repetitive. They had to do something over and over and over and over again in order to accomplish their task. And it was very, very disruptive. So if you were to go and study these machines in the traditional way, you would say both machines are equal. It doesn't matter which one you use. But which one do we want to deploy to our users? And obviously, we know, and we also know from our subjective analysis of this, that this one that perceived slow was really annoying to the users. It was highly disruptive. It was not satisfying at all. There's lots and lots of cases like this. What do we, as computer interface designers, I think we have to think of our goal a little bit more broadly to think about this kind of subjective experience. It has to go beyond pure performance, because this subjective stuff goes bound to influence performance in other more subtle ways. Even if their task today is slower, they're going to be so disengaged, they're going to be so unhappy, they're going to stop using it, or they're going to plan their life to use this thing less, or just do things differently. There's lots of other examples. I'll show you one other one. I want to come back to photos to tell you a little bit about some of the work we're doing right now, which is to go back to annotation. We are, having fully annotated photos is wonderful, because then you can do all kinds of fancy searches. But it's just way too painful to manually annotate photos. So I crossed my fingers and decided to dive into the world of computer vision a little bit and see if we could use some automatic content recognition to help us annotate. So when we looked into face recognition, despite the claim that it's 80% accurate, we found on our actual personal photos it was something like 10 or 20% accurate, because the 80% accuracy claims have to do with idealized photos, not actual personal photos. So we then went a step further and incorporated the observation that photos are taken burstily, so there'll typically be a lot of photos on any given day. And within a given day, people are likely to be wearing the same clothing. So we combine face recognition with a torso color recognition. And then built an interface, actually based on PhotoMesa, to automatically group the photos that the recognition system thought were the same person. So I'm just going to show you very briefly what this interface looks like. And the idea is that we should have a semi-autonomous annotation system. So let a computer vision system make a first guess at combining, at grouping things, let you fix the groups, and then do a single annotation on the whole group. So these are the actual photos from my daughter's birthday party last year with the direct results of the recognition software, and it's pretty bad. But it's reasonably easy and also a little bit fun to fix. I can see those two people are really the same. Oh, I'm just going to turn the volume off for a second. That's the same. This is the same. There's some update problems. But you get the idea, right? You can do a little bit of this drag and drop. This is all her. I'm not going to make this perfect at the moment. This person's not a, that's not a person. That's too many people. I don't want to bother annotating that. You can also see that it'll show you when I mouse over where the photo came from in that big group. You can then say re-layout all. And if I had spent another couple of minutes, I could have correctly grouped all of these things and then just annotate an entire group and say, this is the Dana group. And I've just annotated 20 photos after a few clicks. So it's kind of an interesting direction. This computer vision and interface is all problematic, but I think it's got potential. And it's the kind of thing where, the computer vision doesn't have to get up to 100%. Right now it's too low, but when it gets a little bit higher, this notion of correcting the automatic system will be quite valuable. But even with this interface and that poor quality, we did a study where we had people manually annotate photos and use this system to annotate their photos after, to correct the annotations. And guess what? Performance was about the same. Subjective preference, massive preference of the automatic version. So why was that? So in talking to people afterwards, the feeling was it felt less wasteful of their time. It was a little bit more respectful, right? When you have 30 pictures of one person and you just have to do the same action over and over and over again, it is just degrading. But when you feel like the computer has made an honest effort and you can sort of fix its mistakes and it's more of a partnership, it was just a little bit more engaging. It was a little bit more fun. It actually was sort of helpful because you got to bring the people that you knew together, to bring them together. You got to focus on their face, on their faces, and so on. So anyway, it was a really interesting story, and I think is typical or it's not typical of interfaces. I think it's typical of the way I think interface design ought to go. All right, I guess I am running out of time. I have 2 more things I want to talk about. I think I can just do it. So with all of these projects that I've just talked about, were done more or less with the sort of the conceptual idea of flow in my mind, but without the explicit idea of flow in my head as I was thinking about the design of this software. So I then I had another project which was note-taking, and this one I tried to solve with this after I had started thinking about flow. So I had this in my mind at the time. And the problem was I had used all the traditional kinds of note-taking, traditional and novel kinds of note-taking technology that was available. And I find that they didn't really support my needs very well. Tablet PC plus OneNote came closest. But that was a problem because I had problems with a tablet PC and battery life and all kinds of issues, other issues. But what I really felt was crucial, that I needed something that was extremely fast. Oh, thank you. Integrated searching and authoring, which is something that is surprisingly rare. And the ability to not have to worry about structuring my notes too much. So I came up with this thing called NoteLens, which has those characteristics. And really, there's nothing novel about this at all. It's the most boring, simplest interface that I've ever built. But it's also the one that I use more than any other bit of software I've ever written. It's really just a new GUI on top of the Outlook database. So it's just Outlook with slightly different GUI. There's nothing Nothing novel about it. But I just want to show it. I'm just going to show it to you very briefly. Except I forgot to run it when I booted my machine. Let's see if I can just do this really quick. So it's just a list of notes. Okay, and this is not a preview on the bottom, right? This is the actual authoring tool, and I have it does indexing and searching and stuff like this, and it's what I hope the toolbar, the desktop search turns into. But it has incremental search, so I can look for, say, all of my to-do lists, or everything about PhotoMesa, or everything about Microsoft. I don't know what I'm going to get in here. Okay. Or everything about my developing user interfaces class. Not much, it's starting this week. Everything about the object-oriented programming course I taught last semester, or just its lectures. The point is just that I can navigate through this stuff really, really fast. And the speed is absolutely fundamental, because I just go back and forth through this application 50 times a day. I found out that reading and writing just go hand in hand, and one isn't enough. And spending time, I guess the only other interesting thing that I've learned here is that we treat the first line as special, as the subject, and you can configure whether you want your searches to be restricted to the subject line only, or to everything, or to the full body of the note. And my first view of this was a criticism, because the subject line really is kind of just like a file name. I said that there's no file names, but there are file names if the subject line is special. But it's not a file name because you're not obligated to put anything there. It doesn't have to be unique, and it's integrated into the body of the note. It's not special in any way. And so what I found is that over time, I've tended to start putting keywords into that subject line. And it's helpful if I do, but I don't have to. Right? It's just one of those things where it's kind of strange that the interface has encouraged me to change my behavior, and maybe that's not a good thing. But with a slight shift of behavior, I found that I can do really, really well with this.
So does it include the handwriting notes?
This does not. No handwriting, just text. Right. So there's just a tiny bit of data I have on this. These are the number of characters that people type in on a search. So this is something like a few hundred users and 1,000 weeks worth of use, so moderate amount of use. But anyway, so the average, there's been something like 4 or 5 characters that people typically type in on average per search. There's not that many notes, right? It's not your full file system. It's not 100,000 things. It's several hundred notes. But still, having a very small number of characters worked well, and I think the reason that's so low is because of the incremental feedback. Right? You don't have to type in a whole word and then see what you get. It's fast enough so you get the feedback as you're typing.
You said that you've got this toggle between full text versus the text line piece. I'm just curious, how often do people leave it off for your behavior?
I know I have that data, and I forget. I think it was like 70% search subject only and 30% all. Personally, I'm like 99% search subject only. All right. I have 2 more things. Okay. So with all of this in mind, part of the work I've been doing with John has been to think about how to support people using mobile devices, interfaces for mobile devices. And the challenge that we found is that a lot of interfaces for mobile devices are they require two-handed use. Right? Including many of the ones that I built, like DatelENS. Some of you may have seen that. But what we found is that in actual practice, people really want to whip the device out of their pocket, do something really quick, and put it back in, and they might have something under their hand. And so how can we support one-handed use, which is closely related to flow in terms of the overall experience of being able to just continue on in your life as you are trying to do and not be having to readjust based on what the interface is. So I'm going to show a 2-minute video that actually John made. This is work that will be in Kai this year. But I'll just start it because I think it's standalone, gives a quick idea of what's going on with this.
LaunchFile and AppLens are 2 designs for single-handed interaction with mobile devices. Both systems use active, zoomable notification tiles in place of traditional application launch icons. This first design, called AppLens, uses a tabular fisheye distortion technique to arrange the notification tiles. This view, called the notification view, distributes the available screen real estate equally among the 9 application tiles. Then, an intermediate context view enlarges one application while also providing contextual information about the other tiles, as well as navigation landmarks. Finally, a full zoom level gives the selected tile 100% of the display area for focused interaction. In addition to tapping on the tiles, AppLens uses several simple navigational gestures to move the focus, zoom, and activate applications. A design goal for both approaches was to provide support for devices without a direct manipulation touchscreen, such as a Windows Mobile smartphone. For these devices, gestures are replaced by a directional joystick and numeric keypad. Our second design, called Launch Tile, uses pure zooming and panning rather than tabular fisheye distortion. The launch tile zoom space is divided into 9 zones of 4 tiles each. The home view shows the 4 tiles in the center of the zoom space. From here, the user can pan around with the view snapping to each 4-tile zone, either by using a multi-directional pad or dragging the zoom space itself. A large blue zoom widget provides a visual frame of reference for the user. By tapping blue, the user toggles between the 4-tile zone view and the entire 36-tile zoom space. From any zone, a user then taps one of the 4 tiles to descend into that application. Like AppLens, Launch Tile was also designed to work with a joystick and keypad when appropriate. User comparison of these 2 designs has helped our team to more clearly understand the trade-offs of single-handed mobile device interaction.
So it just sort of gives you a hint of some of the directions we're going and trying to apply some of these ideas to small devices as well. So I think I'm kind of using up my question time, but one last minute. So part of the, all of the interactive visualizations that you've seen, we've implemented using a toolkit that we built called Piccolo, piccolo.net, which is a, very, very briefly, a library for supporting interactive 2D animated structured graphics. And it lets you build a scene graph or a hierarchy of objects, and then it does all of this stuff for you that you want to deal with for custom graphics like animation and region management and picking and rendering and stuff like that. So there's versions for desktop as well as Compact Framework. So those last examples you saw were just use that, and all of the other examples were using the desktop version. And we are now just making a version that sits on top of D3D, so you can get better graphics performance. So if you're looking to do this kind of interactive graphics, take a look. We'd be happy to support your use of it. So, in conclusion, I guess if you only remembered one thing from today's talk, it would be that I think it's crucial that you don't underestimate the importance of speed in supporting creativity and satisfaction. We have to think a little bit more broadly about what it is that we're trying to do as computer designers and not focus only on productivity, but also people's ability to really focus on what it is that they're trying to do. Finally, if you want to learn more about stuff that we're doing, I'll be around today, and I have half an hour right now. Our lab also has an annual symposium and open house, and we've got some brochures here, where we have a day showing everything that is going on. Can come and meet other folks. Thanks. Questions?
I was just curious, would you characterize watching television as a flow experience in the way you were talking about that, where the effort is very low but engagement is relatively high?
I would think of television more as a sitting on the beach experience. Okay. So the answer is no. I put it this way, I don't think Csikszentmihalyi would think of it as a flowful experience.
Is there anything to be had from game design? It seems like game designers may have a lot of practicable knowledge about flow, although I'm not sure they can introspect on it.
I think that the answer probably is yes, and in my nighttime hours I should try and get engaged with that audience, and I must admit I have not, but I think it's probably a reasonable direction to pursue. I think that gamers clearly have an intuition that satisfies pretty much all of the criteria that I've just talked about, right? Certainly including the difficulty of learning and application of those skills, right? So I think the answer is probably yes, but unfortunately I have not done that work. I don't really know.
Are there any physiological changes that happen during flow? Anything that might be like when you run, supposedly there's chemical change in your body that's kind of addictive?
I don't know. I think probably the answer is yes, but I don't know. Mary, what do you know about that?
Oh, we know, the release of beta endorphins, for instance, when you're competing really well.
But that's for athletics.
That's
but
right.
what about non-athletic flow?
We need to study it. I mean, luckily Desney's doing some brain-computer interaction where maybe we'll start to see different areas of the brain get engaged.
I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't think it's really known.
There has been a fair amount of that addiction games. As we're talking about game flow, there might be some work there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much for your time. Thanks very much.
Everything about it. It's like, I don't know your schedule.
Hi, Mary.
Welcome.